At the end of my first talk, we left St. Seraphim as a novice in the monastery of Sarov, working in the carpentry shop, sometimes in the bakery, singing in the choir, sharing to the full in the communal life of the community, but at the same time withdrawing when he was free to the solitude of the forest, which at that time surrounded the monastery of Sarov. The deep forest that stretched then and still today stretches over huge portions of northern Russia. After he had been a novice for some years, 8 years in fact, he was then professed as a monk, and he was given the new name of Seraphim. That is the name of one of the angelic orders, and it means those who are a flame of fire. Very appropriate as a name for the saint. He had a burning, fervent love of God shown in his life of prayer, but also a burning, fervent love for his fellow humans. So let us think of him then, burning as a flame of fire in honor of God and out of love for his fellows. During his novitiate, he had a serious illness, lasting on and off for about 3 years. It seems to have been a form of dropsy. The illness came to an end when he received another vision of the Mother of God. She appeared accompanied by the apostles Peter and John, and she spoke of his special vocation from God. She used the phrase, "He is one of us," or "He belongs to our family." So then St. Seraphim recovered again from this illness, was professed monk, and fairly soon after that he was ordained deacon. He showed a great devotion to the Holy Eucharist, to the Divine Liturgy. It was his custom as deacon to officiate daily at the service. This is unusual in the Orthodox Church. Even a priest does not normally in Orthodoxy celebrate the liturgy daily. Daily communion is almost unheard of in Orthodoxy. Some Orthodox emphasize the importance of frequent communion, but by this they mean usually, at the very most, weekly communion. So St. Seraphim's devotion, his choice, but he would not have been required under obedience to do this, to serve as deacon every day, is something uncommon. During his time as deacon, an important event occurred during the Divine Liturgy on Holy Thursday, Thursday in Holy Week, Maundy Thursday. At a certain point in the service, quite near the beginning, the deacon turns to the west and intones a certain verse ending unto the ages of ages. As St. Seraphim did so on Holy Thursday, he saw Christ entering the west end of the church, surrounded by angels, like a swarm of bees, he said subsequently. And Christ, with this host of angels, in St. Seraphim's vision, moved up towards the sanctuary and disappeared into his icon that was on the icon screen. So dramatic was the effect of this vision on St. Seraphim that for several hours he could not move or speak. The other deacons took him into the sanctuary, and there he remained until he had recovered full consciousness, and he then went and told the abbot about his vision, and the abbot told him not to disclose this to others, but in later life he did mention it to his spiritual children. This vision of Christ during the celebration of the Eucharist shows the profoundly liturgical element in St. Seraphim's spirituality. In the Divine Liturgy of the East, great emphasis is placed on the participation of the angels in the celebration of the Eucharist. There is a great stress upon the unity of the heavenly liturgy with the earthly liturgy. The Eucharistic celebration of the earthly church is described in Orthodoxy as heaven on earth. This unity between the liturgy on high and the liturgy here below, which form but a single celebration, is exactly illustrated in this vision that St. Seraphim received of Christ and the angels. St. Seraphim had a great intensity of prayer. He testified of his time in church. I cannot say whether I was in my body or out of it, but I could remember only that I came out of the church, and I also remember going in. In 1789, an event occurred in St. Seraphim's life that had a decisive impact on his future ministry. He was still a deacon. He was taken by the abbot of the monastery, Pacomi, who was a friend of his family, I think a relative, to officiate at a funeral of a benefactor of the monastery. On their way to the funeral, they stopped in the village of Divievo, which is about 8 miles from Sarov. And there they met an important nun, Mother Alexandra. She had founded a monastic community there in Divievo. When Abbot Pachome and Deacon Seraphim arrived at Divievo, they found Mother Alexandra on her deathbed. And she was concerned about the future of her nuns. She appealed to Abbot Pachome to take care of her nuns after she had died. Pachome said, I am like you old, I am in poor health, but I entrust your nuns to my deacon, Seraphim here. He will look after them after you and I are dead. Pachome with St. Seraphim continued then to the funeral, and having officiated, they returned to Divievo and found that Mother Alexandra had died. From that point on, for the rest of his life, Saint Seraphim had responsibility for the community of nuns in Divievo founded by Mother Alexandra. And this community in due course, as we shall see, grew quite large. In the early years of his position as spiritual father to the nuns, he cannot have seen them very often because he himself was dwelling as a hermit. But certainly from his later years we have many stories of the nuns coming to him to receive spiritual guidance, and we know the teaching that he gave to them. It is interesting that this double visit that St. Seraphim made to Divievo, before the funeral and afterwards, was the only time he actually visited the village. Though for the remaining 40 years of his life he was their spiritual father, he never actually went there in person. They came to see him in the Sarov monastery. He designed their buildings in some detail, but he never set earthly eyes on them. This reflects perhaps St. Seraphim's strictness. After he had returned with Abbot Pachome from the funeral of the benefactor of the Sarov monastery, returned to find Mother Alexandra dead, and the two of them celebrated her funeral, he did not stay the night in the monastery of the nuns. He went back to Sarov, walking the 8 miles, even though there was a heavy storm of rain. Perhaps this is because in Orthodox canon law, a monk is forbidden to spend the night in a women's monastery. This may reflect his strictness in dealing with women. That will be a theme of one of my later talks. We don't know, but at any rate, he never came back to Divievo, despite his close spiritual link with them. Saint Seraphim remained a deacon in the monastery for 7 years, and then he was ordained priest in 1793. And he continued as priest to celebrate the liturgy daily. At this time, he was much troubled by difficulties in his legs. Orthodox church services are long. It is the custom to remain standing for most of the service. So Orthodox clergy and monks tend to suffer as a professional ailment from trouble in their legs. I have suffered myself in that way, though not as badly as St. Seraphim. His legs swelled up, they broke into open sores, had to be bandaged. He, from that point on in his life, the 1790s, found it quite difficult to walk. Now, following the death of Father Pacomi, the abbot of Sarov, in 1794, St. Seraphim, now a priest, sought a blessing to withdraw from the monastery. He's been there for 16 years now, to be allowed to become a hermit in the forest. This is quite widespread in Eastern Christian monasticism. Round the central monastery, where the Cenobitic communal life continues, there will be scattered at a greater or lesser distance from the monastery a certain number of hermits. Often a hermit will have a cell attendant, a younger monk, a novice perhaps, to look after him and cook for him and bring him food. St. Seraphim, for most of his time as a hermit, did not have anyone with him. He lived in total solitude. He used to travel back to the monastery every Saturday to attend the Saturday evening vigil service, and then on Sunday he would receive communion. He did not receive communion at the main liturgy in the monastery church. He attended the morning early liturgy in the infirmary chapel. It's a very curious fact about St. Seraphim. From 1794, for the remaining 39 years of his life, though he was a priest, he never celebrated the Eucharist, neither on his own nor as a concelebrant at the main liturgy of the monastery. We don't know the reason for that. It is one of the unexplained facts in St. Seraphim's life. But, as I've said, the saints are a mystery. However, his piety was deeply Eucharistic, and his practice was to receive communion weekly in the monastery. Then on Sunday he would eat in the refectory. He would receive monks in the afternoon and talk with them, and then in the evening he would walk back to his forest hermitage, a distance of about 4 miles. He would spend then the week in solitude, in prayer, also in manual labour. He had his own vegetable plot. He tried to be as far as possible self-supporting, to grow his own food. At first he did take a supply of bread from the monastery, but in later years he didn't even do that. During most of his time in the forest, he discouraged visitors, and at one point he even blocked the approach to his hermitage with trees so as not to be disturbed. In particular, he discouraged visits from women. So he cannot, during these years, have been very active in being a spiritual guide to the nuns in Diokleia. But he never renounced that particular responsibility. During the period of his hermit life, St. Seraphim was usually dressed in the same kind of clothing as peasants would have worn in the nearby countryside. He had a coarse-woven white smock, he wore boots in winter, and birch bark sandals in the summer. On his head he had a black monastic cap. All his clothing was poor and worn. St. Seraphim was profoundly kenotic in spirit, marked by self-emptying, by simplicity of life, both outward and inward. Over his smock he wore the brass cross which his mother had given him at his departure on pilgrimage to Kiev. He normally had a satchel hung from his shoulders in which he kept the book of the Gospels. His spirituality was strongly scriptural, profoundly evangelical. Now, seclusion in the forest meant for Seraphim not repose or idleness, but a program of heavy manual labour. He dug and cultivated his vegetable plot. He chopped wood to burn in his stove in winter, and the winters are very cold in central Russia. When he was working in the open air, he was often viciously attacked by mosquitoes. I can testify from visits I've made to the forest near Sarov and Diokleia that there are still plenty of mosquitoes there. One visitor found him with flies on his face and blood running down his cheeks in streams. This was a visiting nun. I felt pity for him, she said, and wanted to brush them off. But he said, "Leave them alone, my joy. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord." My joy was his characteristic way of addressing his visitors. He used to say, "My joy, Christ is risen." Even if it wasn't the Paschal season, he nonetheless used the Easter greeting all through the year. That expresses his spirit of joyfulness. But his refusal to kill the mosquitoes shows his deep respect for the animal creation. He loved the world of nature. But we shouldn't sentimentalize his time as a hermit. This story of the blood flowing from where the mosquitoes had stung him shows us that it was a hard life. In his hermitage, St. Seraphim would have recited the daily monastic office. He also had a special cell rule of a scheme of prayer that he devised for himself. Every day he read the Gospels and the Psalms, and he would also have recited the Jesus prayer, sometimes in stillness when not working, but also during his manual labour he would have recited the Jesus prayer. But we know very little about his life of inner prayer. This is hidden from us, as is so much in the lives of God's holy ones. The hermit years were for St. Seraphim a time of joy. He used to sing aloud as he worked in his garden. But they were also times of intense struggle. At one point, for 1,000 days and nights, he prayed almost continuously, standing or kneeling on a stone by night, on a large granite rock in the forest, and by day on a similar rock inside his cell. In this way he imitated the stylite saints of early Syria, who used to stand on the top of pillars. St. Seraphim's equivalent to the pillar was this rock where he remained rooted in prayer. It is known that during his solitary prayer he suffered severely from demonic attacks. This is an aspect of St. Seraphim's life that some modern readers might find difficult to appreciate. But if we leave this out, we are presenting an incomplete portrait of the saint, watered down. Sometimes the attacks of the devil took a physical form. His hair was torn out, and he used to show to his visitors, when he had visitors, where the devil had pulled his hair out, the sore place left in his head. If we find this strange, let's remember that there are similar incidents in the life of a contemporary Western saint of St. Seraphim's, the Curé d'Ars. Once when he was questioned by a visiting layman about these demons, these evil spirits that troubled him in his solitude, he merely said, "They are disgusting." There is a saying, "The Prince of Darkness is a gentleman." That is not true. He is a dishonourable and unpleasant person, and St. Seraphim found that out through his personal experience. One writer about St. Seraphim, the French Orthodox author Olivier Clément, says that his time in the forest was a veritable descent into hell. Yet if the forest was a place of struggle, a place of encounter with the powers of evil, yet on a far more profound level it was a place of encounter with the living God. He felt in the forest the immediate presence of the spiritual world, of God and his angels, the living presence of the Holy Trinity. The forest was indeed for St. Seraphim a thin place. What the Desert Fathers said of the monastic cell applies exactly to St. Seraphim's forest retreat. The monk's cell, they used to say, is like the furnace of Babylon, in which the three children found the Son of God. It is like the pillar of cloud out of which God spoke to Moses. What St. Seraphim valued above all in the forest was silence. Yes, as particularly at the beginning, he sometimes received visits, but later he took steps to prevent visitors, particularly women, coming to him. He blocked the approach. With all his heart, St. Seraphim endorsed the words of St. Isaac the Syrian: "Silence is a mystery of the age to come." He was dwelling, yes, in the eschatological age, in the last times, as he was silent in the forest. "Be silent," St. Seraphim used to say to his disciples. "Be always silent. constantly recalling the presence of God and his name. Nobody ever repented of being silent. Solitude and silence, he continues, give rise to compunction and to meekness. Now, it is important to realize the true nature of silence here. It is not simply an absence of words, a cessation of speech. Silence is not an absence but a presence. Silence is to be aware of the immediate nearness of the living God. In this way, the silent person is the one who listens. So for St. Seraphim, the silence of the forest was a place not of isolation but of communion, communion with God. Now, while the forest was certainly allowing for the attacks of the demons, a place of stillness and peace for St. Seraphim, it was also a place of danger. Not only because of the demonic attacks of which we've spoken, but also danger from human beings. One day in September 1804, St. Seraphim was cutting wood outside his hermitage in the forest when 3 men approached him. They said to him, "Give us money. We know that when people come and visit you, they leave money with you." St. Seraphim replied, "I never take money from anybody." They did not believe him, and they attacked him. He was holding an axe, but he'd been cutting wood. He could have defended himself. He possessed a lot of physical strength, but he preferred to take the way of non-resistance. They beat him up, and they left him, as they thought, dead. They then made their way into his hermitage and searched his cell. They found nothing there except an icon and some old potatoes. Suddenly they were filled with horror for what they had done, thinking they had actually killed St. Seraphim, and they ran away. Now, St. Seraphim, in fact, was not dead, and with great difficulty, crawling rather than walking, he made his way back to the monastery, where the monks were appalled to see him in this grave physical state, covered with blood. He had to rest for about 5 months in the monastery before he recovered, when he insisted on going back to his hermitage in the forest. The 3 men were apprehended, but St. Seraphim insisted that they must not be punished. He said, "If they are punished, I shall leave Sarov and not come back." In fact, various misfortunes afflicted them, so it was said, well, even if men did not punish them, God had done so. But St. Seraphim certainly did not wish for any retaliation. He never fully recovered from that attack. Already, when he'd been chopping down a tree in the forest and it fell on him, his back had been damaged and he was made hunchbacked, but the attack by the robbers meant that he could never really walk upright. In pictures of St. Seraphim you see him bowed and supporting himself on a stick or on the haft of his axe. Probably he was never free from physical pain from that point onwards, but he didn't speak about that. Despite the danger of living alone in the forest, he insisted on returning there. But he found it increasingly difficult to travel back to the monastery each Saturday and then return to his hermitage on Sunday. And he stopped making his weekend visits, with the result that he was not receiving communion. This disturbed the abbot of the monastery. It was no longer Abbot Pachomi, whom I mentioned earlier, who was a close friend of St. Seraphim and a real spiritual father to him. St. Seraphim had also had close relations with his successor, Abbot Isaiah, but Father Nephont, who succeeded Isaiah as abbot, was not so close to St. Seraphim. There seems to have been a certain misunderstanding between them. It's interesting that when Isaiah resigned as abbot because of ill health, the monastery elected St. Seraphim to be abbot of Sarov, but he refused. Nephont, who I am sure was a righteous man, even if not very sympathetic to St. Seraphim, offered an ultimatum to the saint. He had the support of the monastic council. He said, either you must resume making a weekly visit to the monastery so you receive communion each week, or you must come back and live in the monastery. St. Seraphim felt that his legs were not strong enough to carry him back to the monastery, and so he chose to move back into the monastery. This was in the year 1810. On returning to the monastery with the blessing of Abbot Nephont, he was allowed to be enclosed in his cell, not meeting anyone. On Sundays, he did not even attend the liturgy, but communion was brought to him at the door of his cell, though after a time, on the intervention of the local bishop, he was told that he must go to church to receive communion, which he did, but he went not to the main liturgy in the Sarov monastery, but to the early liturgy in the infirmary chapel. So for several years he met nobody. Food was brought to him in the cell. He would come to the door with a cloth over his head and collect it from the novice who brought the food, but he didn't engage in conversation with anyone. So his time of seclusion continued. He used to go out at night to get a little fresh air, and he did some cutting of wood to keep himself with physical labour, but cut off from everyone. However, from around 1815 onwards, he began to open the door of his cell and to receive visitors. For a time they would talk to him. he would not reply, but he would listen, and then light candles and pray for them. But as the years passed, he relaxed his seclusion, particularly from 1825 onwards. He went freely to his near hermitage, not as far in the forest as he'd been before, and he used to receive visitors. So with the end of his seclusion, we enter the last stage of his life, which we shall consider in my next talk.